Hello everyone, and welcome to Paranormal Pathways. Today we are exploring the world of Bigfoot, from the subreddits r/Bigfoot, r/Cryptids, r/Backwoods and viewer submissions. Links to the original post are in the description below, so let's dive in and find out exactly what's lurking in the woods. Obligatory, I am typically not a believer in Bigfoot or anything else paranormal, but I am trying to reserve judgment here. I live in western Kentucky in a very rural, remote area. I live partially what people would consider off-grid, as in I have to drive 35 minutes for gas or groceries, and my house isn't hooked up to city water. I have to haul it in myself every week and fill up a big tank in my front yard. That's not really important to my story in any way other than to point out that I live pretty far out there. I have 200 acres, mostly heavily wooded, and I can, and regularly do, go for a week or so without seeing any other person in real life. So this past Friday I had a Bumble date. That might not be exciting for you guys, but considering I essentially live like the Unabomber, I don't get a lot of company. Date was nice, I cooked her dinner and she joined me as I went out for a smoke on my front porch. By this time I'm going to guess it was about 11 p.m. and pitch black everywhere outside of where my front porch light was illuminating. So my house sits on top of a pretty big hill. Directly north of my yard, the land dips down into like a valley/ditch, then climbs an even bigger, steeper hill into the woods. It's a part of my property I spend a lot of time at. My best deer stands are up that way, and I walk along that higher rise to get to a tiny little pond I fish in, again on my property. Further past this is public state park/lake that doesn't get very many visitors at all. So as we are sitting there, I start hearing the loudest banging of wood on wood. It stopped all conversation and me and my date just stared at each other. It was loud enough that we both visibly started even. Now, my mind immediately went to poachers. Every 3 or 4 years or so, I'd find a makeshift deer stand or two that I'd disassemble and take as mine. Weird time of year for a hunter to be doing that, but I figured if they were willing to hunt on my land illegally, they probably weren't super worried about hunting in the legal season either. But it only went on for like 45 seconds maybe, and it was just louder than it had any right to be. I'm about 6 feet, and while I'm not a bodybuilder, I live a very active lifestyle and am pretty strong. And I wouldn't have been able to be that loud. It legit sounded like someone was just effing up a big tree with an axe handle or something. Like it was angry or violent, more than would be necessary or even possible if someone was like hammering a nail or something. My date was instantly convinced it was a Bigfoot. We went inside and she showed me videos of wood knocking sounds from Bigfoot hunters on YouTube. They didn't really sound right to me. They seemed more rhythmic and less wild than what we heard. But she was insistent, and frankly, I struggle to think of anything in the woods other than a person that would or could make such noises. A person would have had to hike through some pretty dense brush to access my property on the north side, and there's not a streetlight for miles. I'd have seen anyone driving down the road's headlight for literal miles away. The next morning, the date went well, hiked up my paths to roughly where the sound had come from. Not a trace of anything, no footprints or clear sign anyone with any number of legs had been there recently. I was expecting to find splintered wood from someone beating the snot out of one of my trees, but I couldn't find any branches or sticks even out of place. Logically, I know that the answer is that I had a trespasser or prankster, but it seems odd to me the amount of effort someone would have had to go to slip in and back out without me knowing. Miles of hiking to the nearest public parking lot. I did do some calling around on Monday to my nearest neighbors. Small town folk like to talk and are always looking out their windows, but no one could recall a car driving in late at night other than mine and my date's, and those were far earlier in the evening. Was it a Bigfoot? Probably not, but it spooked the heck out of me, and I'm probably done wandering around the woods at night without a rifle on me. Because even if it was a person, there's no question that someone could have really messed me up if they were hitting me as hard as they hit that tree. Here are some of the comments from this post. El Retardo Supreme commented, "Was there just one knock and done, or did it seem like there was some sort of response? A few years ago when living in Oregon, a friend took me out hunting. I had never been before then. We ended up in some very remote areas. We got to a valley that seemed very promising, lots of fresh tracks and scat, both deer and bear. Anyways, we decided to split up. He went west and I went east. I settled down at a decent overlook after hearing some movement around me, just staying quiet and observing the area. After maybe 20 to 30 minutes without anything happening, I heard a very loud series of knocks. I thought woodpeckers at first, no big deal. Before I finished that thought, there was a loud whistle and then one more knock. It seemed like a response, then a response to the response. I didn't think much of it at the time and thought it was my buddy, so I made my way towards him. We met about halfway. He was heading to me. He also heard the knocks and whistles. He thought it was me. Nothing more happened after that, but after finding out that neither one of us was the one making sounds, it made me think a little more about what may have been out there with us." OP responded to El Retardo Supreme. "I didn't hear any sort of response. It seemed like it was coming from one static location and was much louder than a woodpecker. Like I said, it sounded like someone was trying to murder that tree." El Retardo Supreme responded to OP. "I understand. I wasn't implying that you heard a woodpecker. I was just recalling what I thought the first time I heard it. Like you, I was looking for a more conventional explanation. It's definitely weird. Just watch your back out there. By most accounts, where there's one, there's more." Tin Tux also commented, "Well, I can definitely tell you that you are in Squatch country. Other than that, it sounds super unlikely a random person is going to try and prank someone living that far off the grid. You could have shot them, buried them, and no one would ever know. Seems like a dumb idea to me. LOL." OP responded to Tin Tux, "Seems like a dumb idea to me. LOL. That's what I thought too. LOL. People are defensive about their land down here. My date wanted to go out in the woods while the sound was happening, but I wasn't about to get shot by some redneck meth head or something." Ingrid Thor responded to OP, "If you hear it again, do not go out at night. If it is a Sasquatch, and it kinda sounds like that is the case, a tree knock is not an invitation. It's a warning." OP responded to Ingrid Thor, "I can absolutely assure that I would not be remotely tempted were I to hear it again. LOL. Hell, I've even been locking my doors at night, and I've not done that regularly in years." Gray Mars in Space suggested, "I don't think they're actually banging on trees. They are making that sound with their voice. That is why no one finds splintered wood or hears splintering wood." OP responded to Gray Mars in Space. "Someone else pointed that out to me, and while they may be correct, I honestly in the moment couldn't picture anything making that loud a noise with vocal cords. I kid you not, with every whack I legit expected to hear a whole tree fall down." Borg Crossocola responded to Gray Mars in Space. "Now that I think about it, I've never heard of someone seeing a Squatch wood knock." Gray Mars in Space responded to Borg Crossocola. "Yes, it makes little to no sense they would be whacking trees. You would eventually see one doing it. You would see them carrying sticks. You would hear the wood splintering." External City 9144 responded to Gray Mars in Space. "Some of the best footage around is them snapping or messing with trees. Have the knocks ever been heard while no trees are around? I have yet to hear a story where that's the case." There are many more interesting comments on this post. If you would like to dig deeper, the link is in the description below. This encounter was in the comments of the previous story. I thought it deserved its own spot. Mine goes back to 1966, Boy Scout camping trip with about 10 kids and 2 adults. I was 12, but I still remember it loud and clear. It was the second night of a 3-night camping trip. We were camped at the edge of a large meadow. There had been much commotion amongst us kids while on a snipe hunt, which is a game scouts play for a non-existent bird. Flashlight beams scattering across trees and bushes, laughing, yelling, you get the picture. Things quieted down, we got into our pup tents, and soon all was quiet. Sometime in the very early morning, I, and soon all of us, woke up to a loud wood knock from across the meadow. This was a solid hit, kind of like when you hit a baseball just right. A dozen or so seconds later, there was another wood knock or two from farther away. This was a remote and wild area. The idea of a human interloper joking on us seemed pretty far-fetched. Mr. Dennison, our scoutmaster, was up right away. I remember him sternly telling us to stay where we were as he did a census of all the tents. We were all accounted for. He and the assistant got up at that point and built a fire. They took turns on watch the rest of the night. It was sometime after that, before dawn, that we heard whoops in the distance. The next morning, we packed up and left with a night still to go. Mr. Dennison didn't feel well, and we were all pretty stretched out from the early morning experiences. The adults had no answers to our questions on the subject. We were all perplexed and unnerved. Conclusions? The knocks were hard to account for. It wasn't until many years later that the Bigfoot media storm descended upon us. So that aspect of the experience was a true mystery at the time for years later. The whoops, if I'm being truthful and objective, could have been an owl, coyote, or elk. This was a long time ago, and memories tend to depart from reality over time. I hope it was a Bigfoot though, and in context, it may have been. Mr. Dennison died some months later from a heart attack. May his rest be peaceful. Here are the comments from this post. Aspect Otherwise 1831 commented, there had been much commotion amongst us kids while on a snipe hunt. This made me very nostalgic for scouts with my pops, lol. This was a solid hit, kind of like when you hit a baseball just right. A dozen or seconds later, there was another wood knock or two from farther away. Closest description to what I heard thus far. I even joked that it sounded like someone had insulted Joe Pesci's mother, and then gave him a Louisville Slugger. Sports Dice Guy also commented, I was a Boy Scout too, and a part of me is surprised I never had an incident with wood knockings or whoops. This happened in 2011. I was maybe 12, 13 years old and was with my parents in Florida at a hotel, going to Disney soon for the first time. They wanted to get to Disney early, so we called a cab around 6 or 7 a.m. since it was a decent drive. I remember being excited to just be in Florida, since I live in New York. I watched out the window. The sun was up already, but the roads were very empty and quiet. We were traveling on a highway with dividers and highway on the other side parallel to us. And past the other side was tons of open green fields and wilderness, which I was looking at. Being from New York, Long Island, I never saw such lush, flat fields of green. All of a sudden, I noticed up ahead a tall, huge, dark figure at the edge of the road. It looked like he wanted to cross the highway, but he was stationary as we drove by. My first thought was, is that a billboard or something? Since they have big billboards for ads on the highway. I glanced at it and suddenly got a sharp, intense feeling in my gut, like someone punched me. I did a double take and stared at it as we drove by. It looked human-shaped, but like a huge dark mass with thick, almost black fur, and a weird-shaped head, and it was definitely alive, and it wasn't human. I remember saying, Mom, look at that big thing standing there, but she was busy looking at the map and ignored me. I was intrigued, and it was at the back of my mind the entire vacation. When we got home, I started looking into it and learned about Bigfoot and other cryptids and became obsessed. I saw the skunk ape, Bigfoot of Florida. It looked exactly like it. My parents don't believe me, but I know what I saw, and it gave me an intense physical reaction that something wasn't right. It was my instincts. Here are some of the comments from this post. J4R8H commented, there are a lot of thick-ass woods around Disney. Curiously, they're completely off limits to the public. No hiking, no camping, no hunting, no fishing. You can't even walk into them. Technically, they're owned by Disney, but they're managed by the state government. They're called Water Management Area. I have no doubt that there are Sasquatch in there. I wonder if they might be more hostile towards humans than average because of how off limits those woods are. OP responded to J4R8H. Wow, I didn't know that. Seems a bit sus, honestly. You could be right that it'd be more hostile. Outlaw Cozy Jails also commented, hell yes, our bodies hold ancient knowledge. The Hector responded to Outlaw Cozy Jails. Perhaps her brain realized what she was seeing before she could completely internalize it and go, oh look, that's a Bigfoot. My theory. Hey guys, I had a weird experience this New Year's and it's really been bothering me, and I feel the need to share. I could really use any insight on whatever animal or whatever thing chased me away from my camp. So first off, I live in northern Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, northern Litsitz area. On New Year's, my boyfriend and I decided to spend the night chilling in the woods, drinking beer, and just wanted to relax. There's a trail near where we live and it's our favorite to hike, so my dumbass thought it would be a great idea to go slightly off trail, set up our hammocks and hang out. It's a populated area, so I didn't really think too much about it. Here's the thing though, even when we first started setting up our hammocks, I felt something was off. Nothing crazy, just sort of felt off. We made a tiny little fire, opened up a beer, and cheered to a new year. I could tell he was feeling weird too because he was constantly looking around him. But when I mentioned it, we both shrugged it off, assuming that since it was already dark when we arrived that we didn't give ourselves enough time to feel settled yet. Now that's when things started to get weird. We heard a screeching sound coming from behind us and it was loud. Maybe like 30 to 50 feet behind us. We both froze and I just felt my stomach sink. Within seconds we heard it again, but it sounded like it was way off in the distance. Barely audible, so it had to be extremely fast. Then, only about 10 seconds later, we heard it right behind us, very loud. And whatever the F it was, it sounded angry. I wish I could describe this screech, but truly it's difficult to describe. Please excuse how bizarre this may sound, but it was almost like a weird mixture of a raptor and almost like the sound of horse hooves clopping fast on a road. There was a rattle-like sound to the extremely loud, high-pitched screeching. Almost like it was echoing off the trees or something, because you couldn't tell which direction it was coming from. Definitely not a wolf or coyote, and it didn't sound feline either. I spent hours listening to bobcat, mountain lions, lynx, and owl screams, and none of them sounded like it. At this point, we grabbed whatever we could carry and ran out of our little camp and back on trail, and sprinted down the trail. Whatever it was tracking us because we could still hear it screaming over and over in the wooded area. Always sounded like it was maybe 20 to 30 feet to our left, just slightly ahead of us. What's even weirder is that the entire time I didn't hear a twig snap, a leaf crunch, nothing but the screeching. In fact, the entire time of us being there, it was unusually quiet, which after talking about it later is why we both felt so off. We eventually made it off trail and back to our car, but I swear to you, I've never felt true fear like that. Since we left half of our shit there, we went back the next morning and my blanket and his jacket were missing. But I'm assuming a hiker or fisherman took them since there were several cars in the parking space. I'm not saying this was Bigfoot or anything. I'm just curious if anyone else experienced something like this, or if there's an animal I can blame this on. Not to sound dramatic, but this really terrified me and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Here are some of the comments from this post. OC Cam Volkswagen commented, I had a similar experience in New Hampshire when I was 14 to 15. More than anything else, it sounded like a human woman screaming in rage at us. It seemed to be coming from about 20 feet away, but there was nothing at all visible. It was late afternoon, not a dense woods, nor were the trees very thick. So the fact we couldn't see what made the sound jacked up the spookiness to the level of panic. I never definitively determined what it was, but I leaned toward barn owl or bobcat/lynx because those two might have been up in a tree where I wasn't even looking. Of course, so could a Sasquatch. The barn owl has a very frightening screech, particularly so if you've never heard it and aren't expecting it. The sound of hooves you heard might have been that owl screeching while beating its wings. Not that I'm aware they do that, but the grouse or pheasant can scare the pee out of you by beating its wings right before it takes off. It sounds almost like thunder. Most New Hampshire hunters seem to know about that. The main difference between your and my experience was that we just got one scream that lasted about 2 seconds. It wasn't repeated and nothing seemed to be following us as we fled the scene of the incident. Well, here I am too, asked maybe you didn't hear it move because it was actually owls calling to each other. OP responded to, well, here I am too. I looked up owls screaming as well and still sounded nothing like it, but owls or bobcat are the only animals that would make any kind of sense. Despite it being a screech, there was a guttural sound to it, sort of like a woman screaming, except there's no way a human could run that fast. I think it had to be a singular animal because it sounded the same the entire time. There was no reflections in the voice, only when it was right behind us, and it sounded deeper and louder. Other than that, it was the exact same sound for the same amount of time. And the rattle-like quality is what really freaks me out because that's what separated it from any sort of feline animal. I hope that makes any sort of sense. It's really hard to describe what I heard. I'll keep looking up owls though and see if I hear anything close. Doogie Slowbone responded to OP. Hearing Fred Roll's encounters on his YouTube channel, he's described calls kinda like this where they mimic other animals but it sounds off. One of them he said would do owl hoots with clicking in between, kinda like squirrel chatter, but obviously coming from something much bigger. There are quite a few more comments on this encounter. If you would like to dig deeper, the link is in the description below. My name is Rita Swift. I live in Orange County, California. In 1945, my grandfather, George Hunn, told me a story about the time his train hit a large ape creature and bent the cowcatcher on his train. This was in the 1880s, and he was an engineer on a train that ran along the borders of the US and Canada. It was night, and all of a sudden their train hit something, and they stopped the train because the cowcatcher was dragging on the tracks. At first they thought it was a moose, but when they all got out with their lanterns, they discovered this huge smelly ape hung up in the catcher. They only had lanterns for light, and they were in the forest, basically in the middle of nowhere. It took most of the crew to pick it up and lift it into the open flat car. They noticed it was structured differently from a gorilla or ape, and it smelled so bad. The crew got the smell on them. They left it on the flat car because it took at least 2 hours to straighten out the cowcatcher. Good thing my great-grandfather was also a blacksmith. They were at least 2 hours from the next water tower and station of sorts. The brakeman noticed Indians sneaking around in the forest but thought they had disappeared. When they were ready to go, the crew checked on their smelly passenger and he was gone. They looked for tracks and decided the Indians had dragged it away into the forest and across the stream. They found the tracks and pieces of hair and of course the smell. They washed up in the stream and were glad to get rid of it. The smell had even remained in the flat car. My great-grandfather took pieces of the hair back and gave it to a doctor he knew in Michigan. They had all decided the creature had escaped from a circus or a sideshow. Great-grandfather thought it was 8 feet tall and weighed at least 500 pounds. It took 6 men to carry it off the tracks. When my daughter was a student at California State University at Fullerton in 1986, I met a professor of anthropology. The reason I was there was I donated Indonesian fighting swords to her department. They were very old and had belonged to my husband. I just didn't feel comfortable having them in my home anymore. I noticed in her office she had information on the walls about Bigfoot. I told her the story and she believed it was documented. My grandfather said the ape had a different face than what he remembered of a gorilla. He said the teeth were like humans but extremely wide and large. The body hair was thick dark brown with light tipping and the eyes were large and dark. He said they agreed it was male because of its genitalia. Grandfather continued as a railroad engineer on the Colorado-Wyoming line until he retired in 1925. He fought off outlaws with his 6-shooter from the cab. I have a photo of grandfather with the crew stopped at Enid's, Colorado with a large cannon hole in the side of the engine. This was in 1898 when some outlaws on horses pulled up an old Confederate cannon alongside the tracks and fired at the engine. The crew chased them away but left the train damaged. They were on their way to Durango carrying bank money from Denver. Grandfather would never tell stories that were not true. He was a devout Methodist and said his prayers so loud every night the whole house could hear him. He had originally come from Amish in Mercer County, Pennsylvania, but left to fight for the Union in the Civil War. His father did not accept his decision and he never returned to Mercer County. He was born in 1845 and died in 1947 in Claremont, California. My grandpa was born in the last years of the 19th century and spent his entire life living in rural Idaho as a farmer and rancher. He had tons of old cowboy stories he would tell us grandkids. Most of them were funny, some were cautionary, but a few were downright creepy. When my grandpa was 6 years old, he, along with his older brother and a gang of kids from nearby farms, decided to go ice skating for the day. At the time, my great-grandpa was working as a ranch hand and the family lived near Chesterfield, Idaho. Now mostly a ghost town. It was a bright and sunny January day in 1902, and though the temperature was low, the sun kept things somewhat warm. They'd hitched sleighs to their horses and headed down to the Pontouf River to ice skate. There were 8 kids all together, and they were excited to show off their new skates from Christmas. Along with my grandpa and his brother, there were the 3 Robinson kids, Tommy Bear, and the Gooch twins. The best spot to skate was next door to the Gooch's ranch. The river there was broad and shallow, so the ice tended to be thicker, and if they did fall through, they would just get their legs wet. The kids spent a couple hours skating when a loud scream came from a willow bush on the riverbank opposite them. The kids could only watch as a giant man covered head to toe in thick black fur came lumbering out of the bushes. It was carrying a large tree branch and was screaming in rage at the kids. They fled towards the sleighs, trying to scramble up the riverbank in their skates. My grandpa, being the youngest, was at the back of the rush. He couldn't get a good foothold because of his skates and fell back towards the ice. The giant was now crossing the river towards them, screaming and swinging his branch. My grandpa was sure this creature was going to eat him. As my grandpa tells it, Lady Luck smiled down on me that day by the river, because as the giant was midway across the river, the ice gave way. It only submerged its shins, but was slowed down considerably as it tried to get back on top of the ice. This gave my grandpa's brother enough time to jump down and cut the laces off my grandpa's skates. They left the skates and dashed up the riverbank and jumped onto one of the sleigh. As they looked back, the giant man was cresting the riverbank. To their relief, it didn't chase the sleighs. It just stood there hollering at the kids and swinging its tree branch. The kids were able to make it back to the Gooch Ranch, where they told their encounter to John Gooch, the twins' grandfather. Word spread quickly in the tiny farming community, and soon a posse was formed to hunt down the beast. Where the kids had been skating, there was found footprints almost 2 feet in length. My grandpa's skates were found near the tracks. They had both been bent in half like horseshoes. The posse followed them as far as they could, but deep snow prevented their travel any further. The creature was never sighted in the area again. This story captivated the small community, and soon word traveled across the country of the Idaho Wildman. Here is a link to a newspaper article describing the event. That spring, my great-grandpa decided to buy a ranch in the Little Lost River Valley, farther north in Idaho. My grandpa had many other weird and creepy backwoods stories, but he always said that this encounter frightened him the most. He was sure he would have been killed if the giant hadn't broken through the ice and given his brother a chance to cut his laces. In many rural areas of the American West, cutting firewood in national forest is a necessary chore if you want a warm house through the winter. Our home in mountainous central Idaho was no exception. It was normal for my dad to pick me and my brothers up after school and headed to the mountains for an afternoon of firewood gathering. My dad would fell the dead trees, then saw them into chunks. My brothers and I had the task of rolling the wood to the truck and loading it. We would continue this assembly line process until we had a truckload of wood, usually before nightfall. Hot, sweaty, and exhausted, we would pile into the truck cab and make our way down the mountain. At home the next day, we would unload and split the wood and stack it into neat little rows. This process was repeated until we had a winter's worth of fuel for our house, our grandma's cabin, and any extra for elderly neighbors. This particular afternoon, we decided to try a different logging road on the other side of the valley. This was well outside our familiar logging area. No real reason for the change, but my dad said he wanted a change of scenery. This logging road hadn't been maintained in some time. Large rocks and fallen branches littered the path. My brothers and I had to walk out in front, pushing rocks and wood out of the way as my dad lurched the truck up the switchbacks. Yard by yard, we slowly made our way up the mountain. That hike was physically brutal, Well, as we ascended the mountain and got further into the trees, this odd feeling started to set in. I wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion from the hike or something more. There was electricity in the air, like the whole mountain was buzzing at a wavelength just below my senses. In some odd way, it felt like the mountain knew we were there and it wasn't welcome to that fact. I wanted to say something to my brothers, but before I opened my mouth, my younger brother said, "Does anyone else feel like we're not welcome here?" My older brother and I stopped in our tracks and looked back at him. Both of us nodded in agreement. This moment was broken by my dad honking and motioning us to continue clearing the path. Reluctantly, we pushed forward to a small clearing in the woods where we finally stopped the truck. My dad, oblivious to our apprehension or simply choosing to ignore it, grabbed his saw and went to work. As the wood was felled and loaded, I couldn't shake this ominous feeling enveloping me, like a dark shroud. I noticed my brothers were taking occasional glances over their shoulders as we worked. Everyone, but my dad it seemed, was on edge. The sun nestled down into the trees and twilight began to set in. As the light drained from the sky, my anxiety only intensified. It wasn't until my dad unexpectedly told us to load up that a wave of relief flooded over me. I could see the tension in my brothers melt away as well. The truck wasn't fully loaded, an oddity. Getting a half load was a waste, according to my dad. We would sometimes work into the dark just to make sure the truck was full. But tonight, he seemed eager to head home. With everything loaded, we started down the road. Although dead tired, everyone seemed to be in a much lighter mood. We were chatting and cracking jokes while trying to blow off steam from the afternoon. We were almost out of the tree line and into the valley desert. Going down the switchbacks, you want to be careful, especially with a load, even if it was half that. A brown blur jumped up from the downslope side of the switchback. "Shit" was the only word that came out of my dad's mouth as he slammed on the brakes. Loaded with wood and traveling downhill, there was no way to avoid smashing into the blur. The truck finally ground to a standstill. The four of us peered through the windshield, nobody saying a word. Illuminated in the yellow glow of our headlights was a crumpled body of a deer. Grumbling and cursing the deer's existence, my dad exited the truck to investigate. Doing as they were told, my brothers stayed put in the truck. I didn't listen, following close behind my dad. The truck was fine. We hadn't been traveling fast when we smacked the deer, just some hair and blood in the grill guard. Hitting a deer really wasn't that unusual. The mountains were full of them. What was unusual was that deer dropped so quickly. At faster speeds, deer could still be upright and sprinting away to die in the woods after a collision. That last burst of adrenaline dump. This one fell over like a rag doll. Before even approaching the carcass, a deep foul smell hit us. Deer smell bad when they're alive, but this was on a whole nother level. It was the smell of decay and rot. My stomach began to turn as we got closer. My nostrils were burning. Coming up on the deer, it was clearly dead. Really dead. The stench was so overwhelming my eyes were watering. The body was a true horror scene. The deer's eyes were gone, replaced with sunken hollow holes. As if to overcompensate for their absence, the tongue was swollen and black as coal. It could not be contained and hung out the side of its mouth. The underbelly was split open, entrails and offal spilled into the dirt. In the dim headlights, it looked as though the deer's fur and viscera were moving. Wiggling almost. Holding my breath, I bent down for a closer look and my heart stopped. The deer, inside and out, was covered in maggots. It was dead all right, but our truck didn't kill it. Clearly, it had been dead for days, if not weeks. I backed away retching. That electric anxiety came screaming back. My dad was always the quiet, stoic type, but right now, even in the dim headlights of the truck, I could see the abject horror on his face. His gaze wasn't on the deer, but focused down the mountain. Poorly masking the fear in his voice, he told me firmly to walk back to the truck and get inside. I obeyed without objection. As I grabbed the door handle, a loud shriek came out of the trees. Branches were shattering and breaking. Something was heading up the slope toward us. I slammed my door closed just as my dad reached the truck. Before his door was shut, he pressed on the accelerator. The truck lunged forward, sending us over the deer carcass and racing downhill. With mine and my brothers yelling, it was hard to tell if the shrieking was following us. Our truck popped out of the tree line and into the desert sagebrush. Once out of the woods, everything quieted down. We were left with only the rumble of the engine and wind through the half-opened windows. Pulling into our property, the truck came to a stop. We sat in silence. No one moved to leave the truck. Everyone started talking at once. We all had questions. What was the screaming? How does a dead deer jump uphill in front of a truck? There was no way the truck killed it. Dad just shook his head and motioned for us to quiet down. That deer was dead when we hit it. It didn't jump out in front of us. It was thrown at us. We stared at him. He explained that all day up on the mountain he had felt uneasy. Not wanting to worry us boys, he kept it to himself. He described it like walking into a stranger's living room while they were upstairs asleep. That feeling never left him, and as twilight came, he happened to catch a shadow out of the corner of his eye. Not far into the woods, and he saw figures moving from tree to tree. He couldn't focus on them long enough for a good look before they dodged behind trees. His stomach dropped. Working hard to keep his composure, he hurried us to the truck to leave. It was after hitting the deer and discovering it was long dead that my dad pieced together what was happening. Something threw that deer to get us to stop. Before the shrieking began, he could hear something moving in the darkness beyond the road. It was a trap. Running back to the truck could have started an ambush or triggered a prey drive, so we walked back to the truck. The second we were inside, he drove that truck downhill with no intention of stopping for anyone or anything. That feeling of electricity didn't disappear until we hit the country highway. My brothers and I never saw anything as we drove away, but those screams from the forest will never leave my mind. We didn't gather firewood for the rest of the season. For the first time in his life, my dad just bought what we needed. And although we started to gather wood again the next season, we've never been back up that particular mountain. The Forest Service has permanently closed and reclaimed that road. The only way back up into those woods is a long hike. One I'm not interested in ever taking again. Whatever was on that mountain, whatever threw that deer carcass, whatever chased us out of the woods, it did not want us there. It wanted us gone, or worse, it wanted us dead. Hey there, y'all. I'm from the heart of Louisiana, and I gotta share this crazy thing that happened to me out in the swamps. So, I'm a bit of a survivalist. You know, always out in the bayou, hunting and fishing. But this one night, man, it was different. I was out near Lake Bistineau real late, just me and my old lantern. The swamp's kinda spooky at night, but I'm used to it. That night, though, the air was thick, and it felt like the swamp was just holding its breath. I heard these footsteps, not like a deer or a gator, but heavy, like someone walking real deliberate. Thought it was just some drunk guy at first. Then, out of nowhere, these trees start moving apart. I kid you not, it was like something out of a horror movie. And what I saw, I couldn't believe my eyes. This creature, big as a bear, but it wasn't no bear. It looked part ape, part reptile, like something out of a nightmare. Its eyes caught the light from my lantern, shining like two fiery coals. This thing, this swamp monster, I guess you could call it, just stood there, staring at me. I froze. My heart was pounding so loud that I thought I'd hear it. It had this thick, scaly skin. Its arms were long, dangling almost to the ground. I swear it was sniffing the air like it could smell me. I remember thinking, this is it. I'm gator food. But then, as quick as it appeared, it just turned and vanished into the trees. The sound of it moving through the swamp was like nothing I'd heard before. Heavy and purposeful. I hightailed it out of there faster than a crawfish at a boil. Didn't stop till I was clear out of the swamp. I've been in these swamps my whole life. Seen gators, snakes, you name it. But that thing, it wasn't natural. I haven't been back to that part of the swamp since, and I don't plan on it. Y'all can believe it or not, but I know what I saw. The bayou's got its secrets, and some things out there, well, they're better left alone. Stay safe out there, y'all. Hey everyone, I gotta tell you about this wild thing that happened to me in the Everglades. So, I'm 17, male, and all about exploring and stuff, but this was next level. It was getting late one evening and I was just chilling in the Everglades. You know, as you do. The place is spooky after dark, but that's part of the thrill, right? Anyway, there was this nasty stench in the air. Smelled like rotten eggs mixed with swamp muck. I thought maybe it was just a dead gator or something. But then I see this figure, and I'm not messing with you, it was more ape than man. This thing was huge, covered in hair and kinda hunched over. It was standing there in the marsh, staring at me. Dude, its eyes were intense, like it was trying to figure me out. I was totally freaked out. My heart was racing, and all I could think was, no way, this can't be real. But there it was, as real as anything. I couldn't move, just stood there staring back at it. The air felt heavy, like when a storm's about to hit. Then, in a flash, this thing, whatever it was, just turned and bolted into the swamp. It moved so fast, like a linebacker dodging tackles. I heard it crashing through the brush, and then nothing. Just the normal night sounds of the Everglades. I booked it out of there faster than a Miami driver when the light turns green. Told my friends about it, and they thought I was just seeing things or making it up. But I know what I saw. It was too real, too freaky to be just my imagination. So yeah, that's my story. Call it a swamp ape, skunk ape, whatever. But there's something weird in the Everglades, and I saw it. Stay safe out there, and if you smell something funky in the glades, maybe just go the other way. Peace. Hey folks, I'm a hunter from up in Ontario, and I've got a tale that'll make your skin crawl. So I'm out in the bush a lot, right? But this one time near Cobalt, especially close to those old mines, things got real weird. It's common knowledge around these parts about the Sasquatch stories, but the old yellow top? That's something else. This creature's like your typical Bigfoot, but with this wild golden mane. Sounds like something out of a storybook, eh? So there I was, deep in the woods, tracking deer. The forest was quiet, just the wind whispering through the pines. Then, out of nowhere, I catch this odd, musky smell. Not your usual forest scent, more like wet dog mixed with earth. I turn around and bam, I see it. This huge figure standing upright just a stone's throw away. It had this thick, golden mane atop its head, just like the legends say. Its eyes were kinda intelligent, observing me. Not aggressive, but definitely sizing me up. Man, my heart was pounding like a drum in a tragically hip song. I wasn't sure if I should run or just stand there. But the thing, it just gave me this look, almost like it was curious. Then, as quietly as it appeared, it turned and walked back into the trees. It moved so smoothly, like it was part of the forest itself. I didn't stick around to see if it would come back. Got out of there faster than a puck off of Bobby Orr's stick. Told a couple of buddies about it, and they reckon I saw the real old yellow top. I've been in the woods all my life, seen bears, moose, you name it. But this was different, something I can't quite explain. Makes you wonder what else is out there in the backcountry of Ontario. So keep your eyes peeled if you're ever up near Cobalt. You might just see something extraordinary. Cheers!